There's Julius. You'll have individuals like Julius Caesar um, besieging cities, besieging the cities held by Vercingetorix, which and Alesia, and these massive earthworks and fortifications that they build to besiege and hold these and contain the Gauls within the city. Similarly, you'll see that in Sevastopol in 1853. You see it in places like Cold Harbor and Richmond during the Civil War. Trenches have been around a long time. It's just like everything else with World War I. Nothing had been seen on the scale um, that was seen in this conflict. It's the first truly industrialized war. It transforms everything, and that delves into aviation, electronics, telecommunications, all sorts of things. But the war is something that is it's a massive catalyst of change. The tragic benefits of the conflict is the best way to look at it. Um, and when I mentioned industrialized war, one of the single pieces of that industrialized war that makes it what it is what's often referred to as the king of the battlefield artillery. And constantly talk with groups and talk to folks, and you try to articulate how things have changed, and the more things change, the more they remain the same. Some form of artillery had existed for hundreds of years, from the ancient Romans, scorpions and catapults to modern day artillery. And so, but again, nothing had ever been seen on this scale. And when the Battle of the Somme takes place and those British soldiers went over the top, they had gone over the top after they had shelled the Germans for 8 days straight, firing over 1.25 million shells in an 8-day period of time, from 4,000 heavy guns firing nonstop for 8 days. And it's why we get terms like shell shock out of war. We think of modern day post traumatic stress, it's shell shock. Um, and so it's a conflict that overwhelming in pretty much everything that it constitutes. It's overwhelming in the sheer loss of life. It's overwhelming in the advancements in technologies. It's overwhelming in the atrocities that take place. It's a conflict that takes a heavy toll. What's interesting about like artillery, with these screenshots that I have here, it is estimated right now there's approximately 26 million unexploded shells outside of Verdun alone. So it's very much something that still has an impact today, still touches a lot of lives today, in positive and negative ways. But it is how the war takes its toll. In World War One, I mentioned before we were ill prepared, and what that means is when we enter this conflict, we need equipment. We've been making stuff for others. Probably one of our largest single exports was barbed wire, but for us, it was this aspect that okay, now we have 4.5 million when we had 220,000 before. We need to equip these individuals. And so we begin buying equipment. The French 75 is considered an excellent artillery piece. And for most American artillerymen, that is what you're using. We purchase French artillery, we purchase French machine guns, we purchase British machine guns and rifles and helmets, gas masks, everything that we need that we hadn't developed prior to the war, we're having to acquire. And for early Americans showing up, it was definitely an aspect that for us, we showed up. First Americans to show up actually in Westminster Palace were wearing everything they had when they were pursuing Pancho Villa on the Mexican border during the punitive expeditions. And so it's definitely an example of what we didn't have. Some pictures of other artillery pieces. Always am fascinated by the sheer amount of metal that goes into these constructions and the means of moving them. I know through the course of the war, we send overseas approximately 8 to 9 million horses and mules to drive the war effort, and moving these big guns is extreme technology of its day. Um, but it's everything from the small French 75s to the 380 millimeter Big Bertha that's raining shells down on you. And this is a war that takes a new meaning and a lot of conflict because it's a war that's fought 24/7. There are no breaks. We have the famous events like the Christmas truce, but that was on a limited section of the front. And as a whole, it is this reality where it is 24/7. You don't know if there's a trench raiding party coming in. You don't know if they're just going to sporadically drop gas on your position. You constantly had to be alert, and it was exhausting. This picture is actually of star shells. A lot of star shells were used to illuminate battlefields during evening hours or dark, and it allowed them to be able to identify any movement in the field, especially if there's individuals that are going to and from trench lines. Now, as the war evolves, one of the things that kind of stands out is, there's a lot of things that come into play. It's among one of the rainiest periods in history in Europe. It also ended up being some of the hottest summers and coldest winters in Europe at the time. But through it all, that the means of going from point A to point B is crucial. So as the battlefields evolve, as people and technology evolves, for a lot of individuals, it's still that constant threat under artillery, under fire, moving through muddy terrain. There's areas outside Passchendaele that it's almost like Mount Everest. If you fall off the path of the trail and you step in the mud, no one's supposed to help you because you will take them down with them. And it's very much an aspect that even the weather was something that was a threat, and it continuously evolves as such. And while I'm writing, when you guys get questions, please feel free to throw some at me because I can be a kind of a rambling fool sometimes. But
Hey, Tanner,
yeah,
while you're rambling, there's something I want to show. You said something about mules, right?
yes,
Okay, I'm going to take away from you share screen for just 1 second.
no worries.
Keep your PowerPoint ready. Okay, do y'all see this ad? Can you see this, Tanner?
Yeah,
Okay, I found this in the newspapers.com a few days ago. I didn't necessarily expect to find it, but as it turns out, before we sent people over there, we were sending mules to Europe, and they were buying 5,000 in Tennessee alone. So I'll have to send you this later. I discovered this the other day, but this is the first time. This, now we always talk about Columbia as being the mule market. The truth is, Memphis was bigger than Columbia historically, but I guess by World War I found this article in the Tennessean, but Britain was buying a lot of mules from an entity that did business in Columbia, Tennessee. I just thought I'd point that out. So I'm going to give you the screen share back. Okay, you take it back.
Columbia still does the Mule Day every year too.
Oh, I know, but I'd never seen that connection. Go ahead and take the share screen back. Just thought I'd break the.
No worries.
There you go.
But yeah, talking about like weather and terrain, this is an excellent shot of kind of the terrain features. There are large swaths of territory in France and Belgium that become completely deforested, defoliaged in many ways, between the need for harvesting the timber for fortifications and reinforcements to those structures, to the chemical gas that's constantly striking the area, tree bursts from artillery shells. It really does kind of latch onto the idea of what no man's land is. It's truthfully a location that nobody wants, because to take it means you have to cross that field and take the other side, and it again goes back to that meat grinder of constantly being thrown into this terrible situation, which in many cases, or in some cases, high command, especially for the British Army at the time, was kind of disconnected from. You'd see aerial photographs, you'd see maps, but those aren't the same as physically being there, knowing the terrain, knowing the features. But it's another good picture of just what I was describing a second ago, of just the wasteland that was the battlefields of Western Europe at the time. I got one or two more pictures like this. All right. So there's a few components of World War I that's really known for: trenches and chemical weapons. Gas was something that was the unseen horror, terror of the battlefield. And it's kind of comical that to think that the first ones to really field chemical weapons was the French. They would actually field a equivalent of tear gas, and it was super effective. They were able to drive out German forces out of trench line. They were actually surprised by that. But the Germans are notoriously pretty good at trying to one up everybody. So they began pushing out various types of lethal chemical agents uh, that that are scarier more because they have typically aromas that are associated with things that we would think of as positives. You know, the scent of fresh cut grass or the scent of roasted almonds. They can be sweet. One of them actually has more of a pineapple-y smell to it. When you're in an environment that is full of so much death, a sweet aroma like that is one that would typically you would want to kind of take a deep breath and bring it in, and that's kind of the negative aspect of it, but it's also why they're pretty ingenious with the way they're dealt. Um, it drives an effort mean protection. The Germans were the first ones to really field proper gas mask for it, albeit not so much for their mules and horses like this picture, but it was an effort because everything on the battlefield that was a part of your war effort, whether it's your dogs, your horses, your mules, you want to protect them from this agent. Early endeavors were far more crude than what a lot of these pictures show. Or some of your earliest endeavors looked like a large surgical mask that was just filled with an activating agent in it. That to activate the agent, you needed to saturate it in ammonia. And so it was this aspect that you had these large barrels down in the trench in some of these areas full of ammonia. And what's probably the easiest way to get ammonia is it's from the evaporation of urea. So essentially, giant pea barrels. When most of it evaporates and you're left with just the ammonia, that become perfect sources for saturating these early gas masks to protect you from the agents. But as chemical weapons became more and more effective, those type of gas masks quickly were phased out. But it is an idea that for a lot of soldiers, sometimes those animals with them were more than just a fellow individual on the battlefield. They were friends and companions. Now, almost like my screenshots are kind of jumping around all over the place, but with that war effort, there is an aspect of who's all involved, whether it's horses, mules, man, but also people of varying ages. And one of the things that always struck me was the sheer number of individuals who would find themselves joining up and serving from so many wide varying age demographics. The Eastern Front, they had what was known as child labor battalions, which are essentially these 8 to 9 year old on average children that were sent out to help dig trenches, roads, rail lines. On the western side of things, you see things like the Boy Scouts guarding bridges, guarding major infrastructure sections in Britain and France. Girl Guides, which were early iterations of Girl Scouts, found themselves preparing for mass casualty events, riding around, patrolling for in these events like air raid bombings from Zeppelins and the like, and having stretchers ready at hand to commence to providing that medical assistance. But if you guys look down this picture on the bottom left, there's a little boy that's saluting these Serbian officers. And that little boy is to this day considered the youngest soldier recorded in history right now, at least for the 20th century. And he was 8 years old, fought in Serbia against the Austro-Hungarian Empire. One of the stories about Grevik that later came out was in the late 1920s when things started escalating, and it started looking things were going south when it came to Germany's situation and how Italy was approaching Yugoslavia, which is what Serbia became a part of after World War One. When things turned hot, he was required or requested to enlist, or he was being drafted in essentially And at the time when he's being drafted, he went up there and informed them that he'd already served and fought for his country, that he's no longer required to address a draft. And so they had to find his old sergeant and bring him out to let them know that, yeah, he's already fought. He fought the last war, and he's not required to fight in this one. But it is a remarkable aspect of just what was happening. And in many cases, more mentioned, I talked about the grinder briefly. Meat grinder made a lot of countries turn blind eyes to the ages of those who were fighting, and they would go through countless horses and mules that would be killed, but they go through so many men that France, for example, loses a fifth of its male population. But you'd see individuals as young as 8, like Grevik, but you'd also see individuals as old as 80. If you could carry your rifle by the end of the war, countries like Germany and France were taking you, because they were going through so many so fast. During the Battle of the Somme, the British Army was estimated to be losing 500 men every 45 seconds. And I know for some of the smaller schools out there, like those here in Pinterest County, 500 is about the school population, and then be the equivalent of that entire school gone every 45 seconds. And it's hard to really imagine those type of numbers, but it is kind of the reality of it. And for the British Army, they find themselves constantly sending young men home, and these are a couple of examples of young individuals who had served. But it's an aspect or reality where you had individuals. You always hear the story of the young man or family member who was underage that saw his way to try to join up and found his way through. With individuals turning blind eyes or then lying about their age, and it's an old story. But the sheer number and scale it's happening in World War I is pretty incredible. And for me, it's one of the things that stands out with the story, that for all the lives that this war touches, no one was really spared, young or old, men or women. But I mentioned before, there are tragic benefits to these major conflicts, and for World War I, in many ways, it's the advent of a lot of things that we enjoy today. It's one of those things that like wristwatches and pajamas. There's a lot of things that become popular or come out of the conflict, and then post-war aspects like literature and music and movies. But when it came to technology itself, there's a lot of endeavors that would take place over time, and one of what struck me most fancy is just how many different people that it impacts. So I got these 3 images up here associated with these topics, and for me, it's a remarkable aspect going into like telecommunications on the right. Most when the war is going on, this is the industrialized war, and there's a lot of new technologies that can come into play, and one of those is phones. It's the first war to really use phones. And I know for Americans, some of our earliest handsets that we were sending overseas were still stamped or emblazoned with U.S. Forestry Service because they were in fire towers. And so we're grabbing everything we could to send with these soldiers. These are old, heavy phones that you needed to be landlined and secured to, but the Germans figured out a way that you could actually tap into a phone line just simply by staking out these lines not far from it, and you could pick up the electrostatic harmonics of the phone. And so we found ourselves in a position where it's like our codes are being broken. You can't speak just like normal on the phone because they can understand everything you're saying. And so this picture on the right is actually a group of Cherokee and Choctaw code talkers. We think of World War II, we think of the Navajo code talkers. Well, you don't hear about Native American code talkers in Germany or in Europe at the time, and that's because we had done that in the First World War. And the Germans between the wars would send linguists overseas to learn these languages, so they couldn't be so easily fooled again. But it was an effective means, and in many ways, they are among the many unsung heroes of wars, are those who kind of fallen through the cracks that no one hears about. And for me, the Cherokee and the Choctaw code talkers and the Creeks that would be involved in that, they play a huge part in the success of the war, because otherwise, if your enemy knows everything you're doing, it's impossible to succeed. The image in the middle is Marie Curie. I know some of you guys might be familiar with Marie Curie. Marie Curie is a remarkable scientist when it comes into the field of radiology and radiation and its isotopes. And her endeavors in that lead to the ability for her in World War One to create what she calls little Curies, which in this picture she's actually driving one. That's Marie Curie actually there in that image, and she's driving a little Curie, which is essentially essentially a pickup truck or a vehicle from the time, but the back cab is essentially a mobile X-ray machine, and so it improves medical practices closer to the front with the ability to X-ray injuries rather than just immediately quickly deducing that you're going to amputate. And so her endeavors and many similar endeavors in medical practices transforms what had been a painful experience for many into one where lives are saved. And when I say painful experience, I'm yeah, and half-lives are incredible. But from the endeavors that she took and those who work with her, you save lives that otherwise wouldn't survive. That's unfortunately a truth about the matter. You know, we look at the Civil War. You got shot. You had an arm or leg injury. They just amputate, and in some cases, many men wouldn't survive that. All of a sudden, with this war, with the aspects of the little Curies, with the French development of the golden hour and the French use of triage, individuals who in previous wars were assured that they were going to die would survive, and they would survive with some serious injuries that it was kind of really hard to imagine. And I got some images of some of their endeavors later, because once these individuals survive these conflicts, or survive these injuries, and at the end of the conflict, what happens to them? And the medical practices changes in a way that for individuals, soldiers who've survived the war, especially those who have been maimed and in some ways describe themselves as having been turned into monsters, it gives them a chance at a second life. With the developments in reconstructive surgery, with the developments of artists and that would come out and make masks to form fit to these individuals, with development of more modern day prosthetics, has a huge impact, a positive impact on a lot of lives. And the individuals like Marie Curie and others would play a huge part in that. This picture on the left, which I always thought was kind of neat, that is what's known as an Ewing. It's a 4-engine aircraft, and it's designed and built in 1913. To put that into context, the Wright brothers are able to sail away from Kitty Hawk Island in 1903. So it's only been 10 years, and all of a sudden you got a 4-engine plane that can seat 16 occupants, that has a heated cabin, massive advancement in technology. But what's interesting about that aircraft, it's developed in Russia by an engineer by the name of Igor Sikorsky. I don't know if any of you guys are familiar with the name Sikorsky, but there's a whole lot of helicopters in the U.S. military today that are designed by Sikorsky Aviation. And for Igor Sikorsky himself, when 1917 rolls around and the communist uprising takes place with the Bolsheviks, he and many others would try their hand at fleeing Russia. His superior officer actually flees to the Finnish border, is captured, and him and his family are executed. But Igor is able to make it to Murmansk and then makes his way to Britain, where eventually he comes back to the United States. And from the United States, he has that long history with aviation. But this is something that came out just a brief period of time after aviation had become a thing. And for me, it's a part of that aspect of how rapidly technology changed. When the U.S. military declared war on Germany in 1917, we had 30 aircraft in the entire U.S. Air Corps, and only 5, the U.S. Air Corps, and 5 were the U.S. Army Air Corps. 15, the other 25 or so were with the Navy for spotting aircraft. But it was this aspect that we had a handful of very primitive aircraft that weren't armed. They were just for reconnaissance. And at the same time, countries fighting in this war have very much advanced technologies in aviation and as they were, that it really put us in a position where we had to leap forward. I've already kind of rambled about this for a little bit, but I mentioned earlier about the American soldiers that arrived looked like they just came off from the punitive expeditions, and these guys are very much similar to that. With their equipment, you see the old bullseye canteens and Krag 3040s, and it's an assortment of equipment and gear that in previous years had been normal, but by this war had been deemed obsolete. And if any guys are paying attention really to it, their hats that they're wearing, if you think of today, state troopers, park rangers, the Smokey the Bear hat, that is the same exact hat that they're wearing. That's the model 1911 Montana. When the war is over, national parks and then down the road in 1930s, Tennessee State Parks adopts the same thing national parks did, which was, well, national parks coming being 1919, war's over, there's massive stockpiles of cheap military surplus clothes and equipment. What better way to outfit all your new Rangers than with cheap equipment and uniforms that were already adopted by the US government at one point? And in many ways, we still hold to that today. But regarding kind of the aspect, I've heard a lot of individuals always respond to, like, talking about Alvin York. Oh, he's 29 years old. Why would they draft someone so old? But that was already normal for the selective service system at the time. And for a lot of individuals with the draft system as it was, this was an opportunity to do what they can within the confines of that age range. I always find it funny with draft boards in 1917 that a lot of them used the war as a great opportunity, a once in a lifetime opportunity. And that's the way many of them had seen it, because this was an opportunity that you can weed out your population. And when I say that, those unruly people, those troublemakers, those that are all constantly in trouble with the law, this is an opportunity that you can send those boys off, and the army or the military will straighten them out, or they're not coming home. And it's a tragic win-win for those local communities, because those local communities are the ones that are selecting those who are going overseas in essence. Just as Alvin York himself was, he was a hellraiser, a troublemaker before 1915, and those police accounts and records are still in existence by the time he's drafted in 1917. And for a local county draft board that remembers the old Alvin, this is a great opportunity for him to correct his ways, so to speak. But you saw that frequently throughout the country. So when the war breaks out, or I should say when we entered the war, the one thing the U.S. military had that was respected by many countries around the world is the U.S. Navy. And when it comes to the U.S. Navy, it had pride. It had defeated the Spanish Empire during the Spanish-American War, but that's about it. And they were still a strong element to the military. You have the Veracruz landings in 1914, where American sailors, the Blue Jackets, would storm and seize the port city of Veracruz in Mexico because of their receiving of what was considered illegal arms at the time. But we were just definitely in a position where our means were limited, and we were using in many cases, what we had. The gentleman on the left standing, that's Eddie Rickenbacker. He's probably the most famous American flying ace from World War I, with his flying circus as his insignia would be. But we were very much learning a lot of new things pretty fast. I like this picture because it gives a good idea of what American troops are carrying. I mentioned before, going into this war, it's like when we first entered the war, those hats that I was talking about, those 1911 Montanas, that's all we had. And this is a war where steel helmets were a necessity, and we were still wearing a wool felt hat, much like the British, the French, and the Germans had before World War I as well. But they've been in this war. They learned from their mistakes. They developed means of protecting their soldiers. And so when we enter this conflict, we need these things that they've learned. And when it came to the British, we acquired a lot of things. And so this image is great because the helmets that our American troops are carrying were known as Brodie helmets. They're a British helmet that we would acquire, we'd adopt. We'd actually maintain that adoption under what was known as a Kelly helmet later on. But those helmets were British purchased. The gas masks they're carrying are British small box respirators. The gentleman on the left is carrying a light automatic rifle, which is the Shosho, the infamous, I should say, Shosho automatic rifle. We adopted the puttees that were the leg wraps that soldiers wore at the time. The boots we wore were modeled after 1917 trench boots that was developed by the French Army. When it came to overcoats and greatcoats, soldiers would mend them themselves. They would cut them to pieces. The packs we had go back to 1910, but it was the first attempt by the U.S. government to try to make a pack that for the individual soldiers, and they were terrible. They looked like they were just, there was a lot of things we were trying to learn and figure out rapidly. And as a stopgap, buying a lot of equipment from the British and French really helped us going further or going forward through the war. But as the war progresses, and we arrive in the intervention of this war, it leads up closer to the Meuse-Argonne offensive. And for the Meuse-Argonne, events like the pictures I have up here are fairly commonplace, trying to make your way across open ground and terrain. American soldiers you'd see carrying what they can, and you'll see a couple of these guys carrying more standard length shovels. Those are likely engineers going over the top. But it is an aspect that a lot of those trenches, those thousands of miles of trenching, is predominantly done by the men in the field, with a lot of incentives from the constant machine gun and artillery fire. But an endeavor that every time you move forward, you need to be able to maintain your new position or update new ones. So this picture is interesting to me because it ties into more Tennessee history. So when we entered the war, we had to make an agreement with the British and the French because the Allies wanted to absorb all American soldiers to replace their losses. But we wanted to fight as a single force. So to kind of clarify what I'm saying is they didn't want us to be an independent force. They wanted to absorb us within their ranks so that we would maintain under French command or British command, these officers who had fought in this war that know what they're doing. And then for us, we wanted to have a command of our own, American soldiers under American officers, and operations orchestrated by American senior command under John J. Pershing. And so for us, it was this struggle to find that balance in the negotiations to put us in a position. And so the decision is, in essence, that, okay, to have our own force, we'll give 2 divisions to the British and we'll give 2 divisions to the French. And by doing that, we can waylay their issues regarding their own troop losses, supplementing their forces, but at the same time allow us to maintain our own command. And when we do that, under British command, the U.S. government, the U.S. Army, I should say, sends the 30th Division. 30th Division is the division that famously gets nicknamed the Old Hickory Division. It's where the Tennessee National Guard is in, and they are assigned under British command, and they find themselves near this canal. So this image is the San Quentin Canal, and it's a part of the Hindenburg Line. And for German forces, it was a part of this impregnable feature of their terrain that they had built behind their own lines. They saw the handwriting on the wall. They knew that when things go south, they have to have a fallback position that will not break, and it would be this in infinitely long period of time that they could hold it. World War I was actually predicted to last closer to 1922 than it was 1918. And the Germans thought they could hold out over that time to force concessions in the treaties that would come later down the road. But the San Quentin Canal was this massive beast that you had to break the Hindenburg Line. And the Hindenburg Line for the Germans was this impregnable line. It would never break. It wouldn't bend. And it's on the San Quentin Canal that men like Milo Lamert and Joseph Atkinson would be a part of that endeavor to break the Hindenburg Line, and would do so successfully. And to do it over such adverse terrain and conditions is always pretty remarkable. So I talked about some of the aspects a little bit earlier. I know I've been bouncing around all over the place. I like questions typically because if there's something you guys are interested in or angling towards, I can work that angle a little bit more because there's just so much to condense. But for me, it is this aspect that when it comes to World War One, a lot of oftentimes, I've rambled, I've hit on different things, but when it comes to World War One, it does touch all of us, whether we know about it or not. And it's one of those components that for me, it's something that stands the test of time. And we will always feel the positive and negatives of this conflict. When it comes to negatives, we can say that every war after World War One has its roots in World War One. But we can also say things like telecommunications and automobiles and airplanes, and when it comes to modern day radar applications and wireless field phones and watches and pajamas, there's a lot of technologies that come out of it that really play a part in our lives today. But also you see those events like the Sykes-Picot Agreement in 1916 that really puts the war into an aspect that we will see contention from it later on down the road.
Hey, Tanner,
yes,
are you going to talk about Alvin York and the crazy
yes,
Mr. Ripley?
just a couple
Oh
seconds.
my God. Okay.
Sorry about that one.
All right, I'll shut up. I'll shut up.
But I'll get to it. I know I'm running. I'm long-winded, and I apologize. But one of the things I do like touching on real fast before I talk about Alvin and the like is these three gentlemen. I know a lot of you guys are probably familiar with these three gentlemen, and for me, that always stands out this aspect that some great literature that has spanned the 20th century and now in the 21st century has found its way from the battlefields of northern France and Belgium with the likes of Tolkien, the author of Lord of the Rings, and C.S. Lewis with the Chronicles of Narnia, Alan Milne with Winnie the Pooh. And for me, a lot of kids nowadays don't realize that vast connection just simply from the literature, the movies, the TV shows they watch, how it bridges 100 years of time. And when it comes to these individuals, they write with a lot of the events that unfolded within their literature. Alan Milne writing Winnie the Pooh is a good example. For him, he meets the first illustrator for Winnie the Pooh in British Army Intelligence during World War One. But for him, it was writing the characteristics of the emotions of soldiers, or for himself, about the depression, the courage, the life it was on the battlefield, and conveying that in a way that a kid can understand. Tolkien, that's actually at the Battle of the Somme, his regiment's tasked to assault the Regina Trench line, and he is fortunate enough to contract trench fever, which you guys might not be familiar with what trench fever is, but you guys are probably familiar with what it comes from, which is lice. And so for him, with the aspects of lice in the trenches, it is a component that he contracts trench fever, and in many ways probably saved his life. And C.S. Lewis would be at the Somme as well. Touching on one of the quotes, I love this quote. It's from The Two Towers, written by Tolkien, and the picture in the background is actually outside of Passchendaele. And for me, it's the imagery of Tolkien and the battlefields in northern France and Belgium go hand in hand in a lot of respects. But for me, it's you see the way they write, the imagery they can imagine because they've seen it before, and so allows them to compose these great pieces. This is just a brief figure. It's going over losses in life, and to really put it into context. Since 2001, over almost a 20-year span, American Armed Forces had lost a little over 7,000 men. But on the first day of the Somme, the reality of 30 minutes, 19,000 men being gone, for me, puts it a little bit better perspective. That it was just this wanton loss of life. But all right, let me see. I've been just yammering on. I've fallen behind a little bit. Yeah. So when we entered the conflict, Tennessee sends about 110,000 men, of which 4,000 are killed in action. I put this kind of extra note in there with the realities that not all Tennesseans, not all Americans fight and die in the American uniform. A lot had gone overseas early on and joined the French Foreign Legion, and the Princess Pats out of Canada find themselves with the Black Watch in England. They are find themselves in positions where they want to contribute to the war effort. They're going overseas well long before we ever entered the conflict, but that's seen time and time again in later wars as well. But from those events, from what these Tennessee boys and Americans do, we have approximately 7 Medal of Honor recipients from the state of Tennessee alone, and Alvin York being, of course, the most famous. But he lives just an hour away from my little Mert, who was presumptuously awarded. There's a lot more to the story of Alvin when it comes to just him being oftentimes he's the only Medal of Honor recipient someone will remember, and there's 126 of them in total that come out of World War One, and 125 of them you can say have been largely forgotten. And Alvin's one of the few. But for me, it's an aspect of reaching out, looking out, seeing who all else was Medal of Honor recipients. Why did they earn their distinctions? What made them important to the war effort? But addressing what Mr. Perry was asking me about. So these are three kind of Tennessee boys that I like trying to discuss, and I'll try to touch on them as fast as I can. But talking about Americans going into the war early and Tennesseans going into the war early, Kiffin Rockwell is a perfect example of that. Kiffin Rockwell and his brother Paul Rockwell actually enlisted with the French Foreign Legion, and they are already in the war effort as early as 1914. And Paul gets injured, he gets medicaled out, and he finds himself being a war correspondent in Paris, France. Kiffin stays in and eventually transfers to the Free French Flying Corps, which is the beginnings of the Lafayette Escadrille. And for me, it's an interesting component because you see movies like The Flyboys and the like, that he is one of those founding members of that squadron. And for Kiffin, he's not only is he the first American or one of the founding members of Lafayette Escadrille, he's also credited with being one of the first he is the first American pilot to shoot down a hostile plane in combat, and notably does it with a revolver. But he is a component of that aspect of Tennesseans and the American effort even going before the war. Going into Alvin's story, I'll talk a little bit of the Lost Battalion. Alvin York's story is also impacted by another famous story, and that one is the Lost Battalion. And you don't have Alvin's story without the Lost Battalion, and it's essentially this battalion of American troops that gets surrounded. They take their objective, but they're the only ones on the section of the front that takes their objective, and they're surrounded by German forces. And over that duration of time, American High Command realized we need to break these men out. We need to liberate these men. But because the Germans are pulling so many of the reserves to break this pocket of American soldiers, we can outmaneuver the Germans. And that's when Alvin's regiment's put into play. Alvin's division had been actually in reserve, and there was an opportunity that was seen that we can mobilize these men, outmaneuver their position, and be able to drive them out of the equation in essence. And it kind of leads to Alvin York's story. His regiment is where it is because of that Lost Battalion. But for them, it was this aspect of these cascading effect of events. And so for Alvin York, when October 8th rolls around and they jump off their jump off point in the morning, and they proceed to cross the field to the Holmesburg to take that fortified position away from the Germans, they get cut down in a crossfire that pins them down for a significant period of time. And Alvin is, in some regards, kind of one of those, I guess, fate playing a heavy hand. His company is on the extreme left of 2nd Battalion as they're pushing across the field, and his platoon is on the extreme left of his company. So he's in a position to where when they task men to outmaneuver German positions to silence machine guns, he's in that position uniquely to be able to assist with that 17-man patrol. And a lot of times, one of the things that always stood out with me with Alvin's story is oftentimes there's a lot of people that would say that he single-handedly captured X number of Germans, and then Alvin would himself would always stress that he was never alone. I know they went from 17 men down to 8, but for Alvin, he would say that he was never alone, that those other men left of his patrol were there with him. And for him, that was important. So Alvin York, kind of cutting a little bit out of it because I've been talking way too much. I'm sorry, Bill. But Alvin York and his company he becomes famous from his actions in the war, and it's less about what he did on the battlefield. It's more who he was as an individual when he came home, but more to the point, a newspaper article. Saturday Evening Post is a journalist by the name of George Petullo. He's syndicated around the country in the Saturday Evening Post. Writes this article about the second elder goes to war, talking about Alvin York. And Alvin did do amazing things on the battlefield. He's not the most decorated soldier of the war, but like many others, he did an incredible feat. But it's the newspaper article that truly makes him famous. It's what makes him a household name, and it's because it's not picturing just what he had done on the battlefield, but who he was as an individual, largely from the fact that he's coming from backcountry Tennessee, rural environment, comes from an impoverished lifestyle, and is in a position where he had an opportunity in ways in an endeavor to get exempted from the war. Nowadays we'd see him as this conscious objector, but he wanted to serve. He wanted to do his duty, and it was a conflict he dealt with when it came to whether or not he wanted to kill or fight. It was something he had to resolve. But when he comes home, he used what makes him kind of why we still know his name in many ways today is what he kind of does after the war, and the second resurgence of his fame from the film. But it was for him an endeavor for the rest of his life that he speaks and promotes and supports the idea of education. And I think it's one thing that all of us can kind of get behind is that education is important. And Alvin York realizing that when he went into World War I at 29 years old with a third grade education, that education was important. And the outside world, he felt handicapped by how little he knew of it. So when he came home, it's not the technologies themselves that were important, it was the knowledge of them. So it became important for him to establish schools like the Sergeant York Institute or the Alvin York Institute, and endeavors in rural education. All right, quickly going on to old Luke Lee. Luke Lee, his story is kind of incredible because I guess in a way it personifies the Tennessee story. And even from the sheepish grins you see in the picture, they knew what they had done. But when the war comes to end in November of 1918, by this point in time, Kaiser Wilhelm II had already abdicated the throne of Germany. He had fled to the Netherlands, and while he was there in exile, a group of Tennessee boys, led by a Colonel Luke Lee, would decide that Kaiser got away from starting a war that cost millions of lives, and they wanted him to see that he meets justice, that he's tried in court for his crimes. And so he gets this ragtag band of boys with 114th Field Artillery to come together with hijacking a couple staff cars that they had acquired. Well, they had one, but they snatched another one to proceed to go find their way to where the Kaiser had held up. And the Kaiser held up in this residence. The picture is actually of the residence that he's exiled himself to. And so for them, they make their way out to acquire this individual. Well, the whole time they're doing this, they're going through checkpoints. They're making their way out there, and they're in many ways they're less than sober. So it's a couple carloads of drunk individuals essentially making their way to mete out justice. And through the events, they make it to the residence that Wilhelm's at. And today we still believe, we kind of believe now that Kaiser Wilhelm was there when they showed up, but he extricated himself from the scene a little bit as these men were making their way inside. And it's kind of remarkable because after a little bit, I guess you can say they realized they had gotten themselves in a little deeper than they probably should have been, and would proceed to make their way out. But in the process, one of the gentlemen in the group would actually make his way and steal one of the Kaiser's ashtrays, which Kaiser Wilhelm would lodge a formal complaint to an American delegation regarding the fact that this was stolen from his residence and that it's his and it has his family seal on it. but it's the funnier stories when it comes to the endeavors. But yeah, it's
Tanner,
that
Tanner,
yeah.
um, I'm gonna painfully cut you off there, but before I do, I
Oh,
want to tell the teachers
yeah.
that I will email everyone the Washington Post story about this ashtray
Yeah.
because it sounds made up. The whole story sounds made up, but that ashtray does exist, and it
Mhm.
was owned by one of Luke Lee's colleagues, who later owned a Major League Baseball team, and he kept it like in a secret place. And one time a reporter came by and he showed it to him. He had it in a safe, and so apparently the ashtray really does exist. I used to think it was totally bizarre, not
Yeah.
true. Um, Tanner has done a great job. It is almost 5 o'clock. I need to move on to the next topic. Tanner, you're one of the things I want to compliment you on are these photographs. Not necessarily just the ones that you're showing me now,
Yeah.
but you've gone through a lot of British War Museum
Yes.
photographs, haven't you?
The National Archives there is the British Imperial War Archives is pretty incredible.
Yeah.
Then with the British and the French, and we're fortunate enough too that the Library of Congress here and the National Archives here is also a great resource, because they not only have photographs. This is a war that's heavily photographed. There's a lot of photography in this war, from individual soldiers carrying 1915 Kodak vest cameras to motion picture photography. And so there's an excellent amount or assortment of resources regarding that. If just looking it up, diving into it, you can find a lot about what you're looking for.
Yeah. Well, when I found that collection, my wife said, "Can you come away from the laptop?" And I said, "Not tonight. We'll be looking at these for some time." David, are you out there?
Yeah, there's so much.
Is David, Ewing, are you out there?
Yes.
Hi, David.
Hello, Bill.
I'm
Let's
going to
see.
take away the screen sharing. Can you take the screen sharing now?
Let me see if I can. Cannot share right now.
Okay, it doesn't let you share screen?
No.
Okay, at the bottom.
I'll try again. It says you cannot share the screen while the other participant is sharing.
Let me cancel
Okay.
my stuff.
Okay,
There you go.
now try it.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, that works. Let's see.
Okay, David has already earned his keep today because earlier today, David had to hear me speak.
I always enjoy hearing you speak, Bill.
Yeah, on a different topic entirely. There are 4 or 5 subjects that David Ewing knows more about than anyone else. And this is one of those 4 or 5 subjects. And I generally find, I've heard a lot of people talk about the passage of the 19th Amendment in Nashville. And I think David's presentation is the most interesting. He also knows a lot about the Centennial Exposition, the Civil Rights Movement. You do tours of Vanderbilt campus now, David?
That was just a one-off today that a group from South Carolina wanted a tour, and no one from Vanderbilt can give them a tour, so here I was.
Okay. Well, I'm going to let you take over, David. You're going to talk about votes for women.
Yes, thank you again, Bill, and thank you, teachers, for educating our next generation of leaders, and thank you for being interested in Tennessee history. There are a lot of nerdy people like Bill and myself, but this is one of my favorite topics. And it's really how Tennessee gave 27 million women the right to vote. It's one of the greatest stories in Tennessee history. It's one of the greatest stories in American history. And unfortunately, we as a state do not give these women enough credit and talk about this story. As you know, the 100th anniversary was during a global pandemic. And it's very ironic because as many of you all know, and definitely Bill knows, that our last global pandemic was around 1918 and 1919 when the women were trying to get this over the finish line. So this is also a story of women in leadership. And so I'm going to give you a brief kind of history of women in leadership, particularly in Nashville and what happened before. This is a school called the Nashville Female Academy that started in the 1820s and stopped teaching in 1862 at the outbreak of the Civil War and the occupation of Nashville. One of the great things about Nashville is we call the city, and can everyone see these screens? Yes? Bill, can you all see my screens? I'm assuming that that's a yes. Okay. The Nashville's nickname is the Athens of the South. We have more colleges and universities per capita than any other city except Boston. We also have we used to have a lot of women's colleges back in the day. And this was the first, this Nashville Female Academy. It was located on Church Street near the YMCA and where Amazon is located today near the viaduct. And let's see. Okay. Now, the other famous school that started right around that time was the Ward Seminary for Young Ladies. It started in 1865. It was on 8th Avenue, now Rosa Parks, kind of near where the old Walter Nipper sporting goods store is, or if you know, there's a Standard Club building there too. And it educated a lot of women, not only in Tennessee, but all over the Southeast. And then in 1890, in the old Adelicia Ackland mansion, there was a college started by two women who are listed here, Miss Hood and Miss Heron. And they started what was called the Belmont College for Young Women. And it was literally using the grounds of Adelicia Ackland's mansion in the home. The Ward Seminary that was downtown and this Belmont College for Women merged in 1914, and they decided to move out of downtown and locate on the campus of, which is now called Ward Belmont. Ward Belmont ends up being bought by the Baptists in 1951, and they closed this school, unfortunately. And then the same people that used to run Ward Belmont started another women's kind of high school, which is Harpeth Hall. And if you're talking about kind of education standards of great Tennesseans and great women, Harpeth Hall has three graduates that are worth mentioning. One being Reese Witherspoon, who is one of the most powerful women in Hollywood. The other being Amy Grant, who is a great singer and has really blazed a trail for the Christian music community. And the other is Tracy Calkins, who won an Olympic gold medal in the 1972 Olympics for swimming. But the other schools that we knew here from the turn of the century in the 1890s is Radnor College, which was out on Nolensville Road. None of, sadly, these buildings exist anymore.
Hey, David.
Yes. Yes.
Your PowerPoint has not advanced beyond the first slide. So I'm going to ask you to.
So reshare.
Now it has.
Okay, that's weird.
Well,
can you see? What do you see? Do you see my view of it?
I now see the Radnor College slide, but I didn't before.
Okay, do you see my view of it with the things on the left, or you just see all?
I see your view of it with the things on the left.
Okay, so the question is, I'm going to go to the current slide and see, can you see that now?
I still see your version. I'm going to suggest that you go out of share screen and go back in. I know it doesn't make any sense.
Okay, we'll try that. Let's see. Technology. Let's see. Okay, so.
By the way, at some point, David, we're going to do an in-service where you just walk around your little museum and show the stuff you have.
I would love that. Okay, I'm reshare. So did that work or?
Well, try to.
Okay, we'll
go
stop.
Back to the PowerPoint. Go back to the PowerPoint.
Okay, let's see. Window. Share. And let's try the current slide. Is that working? Okay,
go ahead and start talking and we'll go from there. We're at Radnor College.
Okay, can you see the next slide?
No.
We're still at Radnor College.
Yeah.
That's weird. Should I just do my view then? Because you could see those. It's not as.
Well,
What do you think?
that's fine with me. There, okay, now I see it. Now I see it. Now I
But
see the new,
that's under my view though, right?
well, whatever. If that
Okay.
works. I'll tell you what, I'll keep my mute undone and you just keep talking and I'll tell you what we see, okay?
Okay, very good. So this building here is Price's College for Women. This is also a building that no longer exists in Nashville. It's in the heart of Nashville. It's on the corner of 8th and Broadway. The Estes Kefauver Federal Courthouse is where this is today. And this was a college for women and also a dorm, if you will, that people could stay there on campus. When the college closed, it just became some apartments. And then when they built the new courthouse, we tore it down. Another college for women was in East Nashville on the site of the Casey homes off of Shelby, the Bosqueville College. And actually the original name of the housing project was Bosqueville College, Bosqueville Heights. And then it became named after James Casey after he was chairman of the board of the housing fund and died suddenly. Women in leadership has been a very important part of our city. And this is a favorite picture of mine that came from my personal collection. This is a group of women from the Ladies Hermitage Association. And they are having a kind of parade, if you will, from downtown to Centennial Park during the World's Fair in 1897. But when you talk about women in leadership groups, you really need to start with the Ladies Hermitage Association. In Andrew Jackson's home was in really bad shape when he died in 1845, and then it got to be in worse shape when his son and his daughter-in-law, Sarah York, were living in there. His son was not a very good businessman and ran up a bunch of debt on the house, and they didn't really take care of it. And of course, during the Civil War, people were occupied, people had other things to do. And so Andrew Jackson Jr. dies in a hunting accident in 1865. And they end up selling the house to the state of Tennessee. The state of Tennessee gives them a life estate. And so if you have a life estate of a house, you are not going to spend any money on it because you don't really own it anymore. And if you are the holder of the property and someone else is living there, you're not going to fix it up until they leave. And so Sarah York Jackson dies in 1887. And then the state of Tennessee finally gets control of it. The state of Tennessee, interestingly enough, wants to, and this is the state capital kind of after the Civil War, the legislature already has plans for the house. There were actually a bunch of ideas. One was to turn it into a West Point for Southerners in honor of Andrew Jackson, the great general. The other was to give it to the Confederate veterans and make it a home for them so they could stay there in their old age. But this group of women had other plans. This group of women, which included some other Jackson granddaughters, decided that they wanted to turn it into a museum. Now, what's interesting about this is the model that they used was Mount Vernon. A group of women had saved George Washington's home and called it the Mount Vernon Ladies. And so that's the legislature was literally able to, so they lobbied the legislature. The legislature was ready to give it to these Confederate veterans. These women said, don't give it to them. They will burn the house down. So they did a compromise that they built a Confederate veterans home on the 1,000 acres of Andrew Jackson's property. If you go out to the Hermitage today, kind of off in the back near the church, there's a Confederate cemetery out there. Next to the Confederate cemetery, there was an old house, which was the Confederate veterans home. And yes, those men did accidentally burn the house down. So the women were right in saving the home. But what this did, the legislature at first only gave them 25 acres of the house and 25 acres around it. And they appointed a group of men to oversee their every move. Although the governor who appointed this group of men, they ended up not doing very much because these women were really in charge and well organized. And one of the things that they did was to raise money to basically buy back the furniture and the items that were inside the house from Andrew Jackson's grandson. And they slowly but surely, piece by piece, did it. and they were very successful. This kind of organization and fundraising and political organizing helped women later, particularly with the women's suffrage movement. Later, you had President Roosevelt come to the Hermitage in 1907, and it also brought more attention to the Hermitage. One of the things that the women did was document the Hermitage history. This is Mary Doris, who was one of the early regents of the Ladies Hermitage Association. She wrote a book about literally preserving the Hermitage. And then Mary French Caldwell wrote a book about the Hermitage, and Andrew Jackson too as well. What's interesting about women's clubs, so you had the Ladies Hermitage around, then we had the DAR, the Cumberland chapter of the Daughters of the American Revolution. And they also served a big purpose in town for women in leadership and organizations. But the most probably famous group happened because of these men. This is the executive committee of the Tennessee Centennial Exposition. The World's Fair that we had 125 years ago today, this year, was organized by an executive committee of all white men. And therefore, a group of women led by Kate Kirkman, who is seen here, had their own project to do, which was a women's building. And if you know anything, so this is a picture of the grounds of the World's Fair. The Parthenon is kind of in the middle. And very similar to the Chicago World's Fair, there were a bunch of temporary buildings built that were torn down and not meant to be permanent. The Parthenon was later made permanent in the 1920s by the city of Nashville. But we were a year late celebrating our anniversary because Tennessee became the 16th state on June 1st, 1796, when President George Washington signed the papers, making us the final state to join the Union under the first president. So we actually wanted to celebrate on our actual anniversary. So they met on June 1st, 1896 in Centennial Park. The Parthenon was just starting its construction. Certain other buildings had their foundations just being poured and built. But the women had built this building already. The women's building was the first building to be built and was ready for the actual anniversary. These group of women from the women's board of the Centennial handed the keys over to the governor and the mayor and said, "We are done." None of the other buildings were finished on time. The architect of this building was Sarah Ward Conley. Remember Ward Seminary in Ward, Belmont? Her father was Dr. Ward, who established the famous Ward Seminary. And she was an architect. And so she designed this women's building to look like Andrew Jackson's Hermitage, but it was a building on the inside that had a lot of accomplishments that women had done in art and poetry and other fields. The most kind of interesting thing to me about our World's Fair, which is why I started here, was this woman, Susan B. Anthony. I was reading a history book of the World's Fair that was done in 1898, the next year, and it was done by the same group, the Executive Committee of White Men. And there was one line in the book that I read years ago, and I'm on the board of the Parthenon and the Conservancy, and it said, "Oh, and by the way, Susan B. Anthony came to the World's Fair." And I'm like, wait a minute, how did you just bury this lead? So Susan B. Anthony was invited to speak at the Women's Building right before the World's Fair closed. Now you have to understand that Susan B. Anthony, although she was invited, she got a very frothy reception there. Because what did Susan B. Anthony do before she got into the suffrage movement? Well, one, she was in the temperance movement, like a lot of women at the time. I don't think that was offensive to the local women. What was offensive to the local women was she was involved in the abolitionist movement. And interestingly enough, while she was here, she spoke at the Women's Building in Centennial Park. She spoke at Fisk University. Well, at Fisk University, she didn't speak about suffrage. Probably the African-American students didn't think that they would get suffrage. She spoke about her work in abolition. She also spoke at the Vine Street Synagogue while here, and she also spoke at the Ryman Auditorium, which then was known as the Union Gospel Tabernacle. And she met during this time in 1897 a young Nashville socialite by the name of Ann Dallas. And Dallas's father was a cotton mill owner, and she was a very wealthy, well-educated socialite who had attended Ward Seminary and was taking classes at Vanderbilt. So this meeting during the World's Fair kind of changed her life and put her on a different track, because it is very easy for a privileged white woman in the South during this time, even though that you don't have the right to vote, status quo is pretty good for you, because your family and your kind of hierarchy is pretty good, particularly if African Americans are not given the right to vote or a proper place in society. Ann Dallas was on the Young Women's Committee that organized the women's building, so she also had a leadership position there. You ask where the women's building was in location to the Parthenon. If you've been to the Parthenon, you've seen this unusual kind of monument and just walked by it and never looked at it. If you look at the plaque, it says that this is where the women's building was. So interestingly enough, way back then in 1897, these women were interested in saying, 100 years from now, 200 years from now, we want people to know that we had a building and it was located right there. Interestingly enough, this group of white women did not include Black women in their women's building. And there was a whole nother group of Black women who organized part of the Negro building, which was a separate building also in Centennial Park. And these were local leaders in the African American community, including J.C. Napier's wife and a lot of other doctors and lawyers' wives too. And what they did, they put on programs inside the Negro building that include culture, art, poetry, education. Many of these women were teachers and nurses and other educators. One of the things that happened during the World's Fair, there was a Negro Teachers Day, and they started at the Capitol and they marched from the Capitol all the way to Centennial Park. My great-grandfather was a teacher in the African American schools at Nashville at the time. We were segregated, and so was his sister. But interestingly enough, getting back to the white women who put this World's Fair together, they were missing everything. After the building was done and the World's Fair was over, the men had established a group, the executive committee. They met quarterly just to kind of pat themselves on the back and said, what a great job we did during the centennial. 1.8 million people visited Nashville, Tennessee, hard to believe, in 6 months during 1897, before airplanes and also before most people had cars. The railroads were very important to the World's Fair, and that's how most people got here. And so these men, including John W. Thomas, who was president of the railroad, Major Lewis, they had these quarterly meetings where they just kind of reminisced about the great job they did at the World's Fair. This was kind of Watauga before Watauga. Watauga was a group of white male businessmen that started meeting in the 50s and all the way up to the early 70s that decided what things would get built in Nashville, where the interstate would go through. And literally there were the presidents of the banks, the insurance companies, the university presidents, the heads of the newspapers. And back then, if you met in a kind of a backfilled room of the right people, when we had local ownership, things got done. So the women did the same thing. They wanted to continue to meet. They formalized their group a little bit more than the men did and formed something called the Centennial Club, which is still around today. The Centennial Club was located in downtown Nashville. This is one of their later versions of the Centennial Club. This building stood till about 12 years ago. It was across the street from the Music City Center, and now there's a one hotel on that spot where across from the JW Marriott. This is a membership card for the Centennial Club. Once again, this was women. They did great things for their leadership. The other group that was really big at the time was the Junior League. The Junior League started 101 years ago. And once again, it was a group of women that did civic things and organized and did lots of things here in Nashville. This was a concert that they held at the Ryman Auditorium in 1923. There was later a Junior League house. The Junior League had a home for, as they called back then, crippled children. These are children that are stricken with polio, and there's a kind of mobile circus that is outside the Junior League home. But what's interesting about this scenario is they ran this home for crippled children up until the 60s. And this home for crippled children merged with the Vanderbilt Hospital. Vanderbilt did not have a children's hospital until they merged it with this home. And what we now know as the Monroe Carroll Children's Hospital started with this junior league hospital here. So we had lots of volunteers in the junior league, but the other person I want to tell you about is the African American community. The women had something called the Blue Triangle League, which was a part of the YMCA, albeit segregated because the regular Y would not allow them to be in there. This is another group of, this is taken in the 20s, of older African American women and volunteers. And African Americans also did things socially, but separately during this time. This is one of my favorite Nashvilleians named Josephine Holloway. She was the founder of the first Girl Scout troop in Nashville, Tennessee, and she started it in the early 20s. She was invited by the founder of the Girl Scouts to meet her at Peabody College after she expressed interest to start a Girl Scout troop. And Josephine Holloway started one. She later had a child and she had to stop the troop. But when she wanted to restart, when the child was old enough to be a scout, there was already a white troop that had just started too. And the white troop of the Girl Scouts told her, you can't be in our group because the scouts were segregated, even though she started the first Girl Scout troop. So what Josephine Holloway did was bought some land north of Rivergate Mall near Goodlettsville and started her own organization with a summer camp and uniforms. The two actually merged in the early 60s, and now Camp Holloway is one of the kind of signature camps. So I give you all that to kind of lay the ground for what happened with the women's suffrage movement that we are going to start talking about. So the 19th Amendment to the Constitution was written by Susan B. Anthony. She based it on what the 15th Amendment said and gave the rights to vote to African American men after the Civil War. And it's very simple. It just says the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged on the account by the United States or any state on the account of sex. That's all it says. And so the women's suffrage movement was this great movement started in Seneca Falls, New York. And in 1848, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott, and later joined by Susan B. Anthony, started this convention to demand that women get the right to vote. And here is Susan B. Anthony and one of the early leaders. So here's your schoolhouse rock lesson on how to amend the Constitution. It's very hard, and it probably should be very hard. The main way it's amended is up at the top, that basically 2/3 of the US House and the US Senate need to ratify this amendment. So today we talk about 60 votes being hard in the Senate. Try 67. So once you get 2/3 of the House and 2/3 of the Senate, congratulations, you're only halfway done. Then it must go to the states for ratification. 3/4 of the states need to ratify the amendment for it to happen. And in 1920, before Alaska and Hawaii joined the United States, that was 36 states. So this is Ann Dallas Dudley. She started the Nashville Equal Suffrage League in 1911. She was determined, and this was a very controversial thing at the time, because at the time, women in the South, and particularly in Tennessee, did not want women to get the right to vote. If you took a poll back then, a majority of women would say, no, we don't want the right to vote. And of course, a majority of the men don't want the right to vote. And you will see later from some slides that kind of disparage women, but most of the time, the people that didn't want women's suffrage, what would they say about these women that were trying to get the right to vote? They were not educated. They were not from good families. They hated men. They weren't married. They didn't have any children. They were ugly. They said all these things. And Ann Dallas Dudley kind of blew up all those stereotypes. Here's a picture with her and her oldest child, Guilford, and then her young daughter, Trevania. This was almost used as propaganda. Here is a very well-to-do white woman with children, who is nicely dressed, these are the people that want women to have the right to vote. 1914 was a very important year for women's suffrage in Tennessee. Ann Dallas Dudley kind of bucked the trend of Tennessee society and organized the first women's suffrage parades in the Southeast. So think about that. None of these other cities, Atlanta, Birmingham, Memphis, were having women literally march in the street. This picture is actually from 1916. There's only one picture of these 3 years of suffrage parades, which is really sad and unfortunate when you think about all the effort. Now, what is really sad to me personally, Ann Dallas Dudley, if she were around today, she would like social media and TikTok and Instagram, because she had the wherewithal for her May 1st parade in 1914, 15, and 16 to have a motion picture film crew tape these. And sadly, these don't exist today. And they were shown all across the country in movie theaters about what was going on here. And it got the attention of the organization that Susan B. Anthony had started, the National American Women's Suffrage Association. And so Ann Dallas Dudley literally invites this organization to have their national convention here in Tennessee, right here in Nashville. Now, when we opened up our convention center here in Nashville about 8 years ago, we had the NRA convention here. The NRA convention brought about 60,000 people. The NRA convention is not going to go to New York or California because they don't have pro-gun laws. And at the time, Tennessee was not really seen as a state that you would want to go to for suffrage because it wasn't very pro-suffrage. But they were so impressed by Ann Dallas Dudley, they came here anyway. Now, this is kind of one of my pet peeves in history. And when Bill talked today, I was talking about a couple of historic markers that are in downtown Nashville that are literally in the wrong place. So Ann Dallas Dudley in 1914, let me tell you the story about her and these parades. She organized the first women's suffrage parades in the whole South. And 900 people marched in this parade with her through the streets of downtown Nashville to Centennial Park, where there were another 1,000 people. So she spoke outside the Parthenon to this group of almost 2,000 people. The Tennessean at the time said it was the first time in Tennessee history a woman had spoken to a large group of people outside. I'll say that again. First time in Tennessee history a woman had spoken to a large group of people outside. And so this is a really big deal. And at the Parthenon that day, Ann Dallas Dudley said every movement in America starts with a minority. And she spoke on the steps of the Parthenon demanding that women have the right to vote. This is how the state of Tennessee put up a historic marker about 15 or 20 years ago, kind of honoring that day. And if you look down there at the very end, it says May 1st, 1916. Ann Dudley walked from downtown Nashville to Centennial Park to demonstrate her support for the right of women to vote. It doesn't talk about the 1,000 people that marched with her. It doesn't talk about the first woman to give a speech outside to a large group in Tennessee history. That sentence makes it sound like she was just walking by herself during her lunch hour, basically, from downtown to Centennial Park because she wanted women to have the right to vote. That marker still stands in front of the Parthenon. In front of the entrance of the park. So the convention came here in 1914. And we've all been to conventions before where there's more goof off time and golf time than work time. Not these women. These women were so determined to be here. So in 1914, 900 women came to Nashville. Many of them stayed at the Hermitage Hotel, which was right near the two convention sites. The day sessions of the convention happened in the room where it happened in the state capitol a few blocks away. So can you imagine? These women met in the House of Representatives chamber, which just 6 years later would be the battleground for whether 27 million women get the right to vote. So they started their sessions around 8:30. The Capitol closed then, as it does today, around 4 o'clock. They took a dinner break, and their evening sessions were at the Ryman Auditorium. This is the only picture I've ever seen of their convention at the Ryman Auditorium. And as you could see, the place is just packed full of people. And getting back to not golf time or goof off time, the night sessions. The night sessions started around 6:30 or 7 o'clock. They ended every evening at the Ryman at 3 a.m. These women were serious. They were going to get the right to vote. They did not come here to goof off or play around. If you talk about the women's suffrage movement, this woman gets all the credit in most history books and even around here sometimes. This is Alice Paul. And in 1914, the year that Anne Dallas Dudley had these famous suffrage parades and the year that they had hosted the National Convention, Alice Paul broke off from the organization that Susan B. Anthony had started and started another organization called the National Women's Party. The National Women's Party was a more radical group than the Anne Dallas Dudley group. And the way I like to explain it is the civil rights movement of Dr. King in the 50s and 60s. There were two, by the 60s, there were two civil rights organizations, major organizations in this group. There was Dr. King and John Lewis and Rosa Parks, who did things peacefully and nonviolent. There was another group of people that also wanted civil rights, but they had totally different tactics. It was led by people like Malcolm X, the Black Panthers, Stokely Carmichael, Huey Newton. And they did not care if someone's white blood spilled for them to get their civil rights. It was the Black Power movement at the time. Remember the berets, the sunglasses, the uniforms. And so both Dr. King and the Black Panthers wanted civil rights, but they had different ways of going about it. And very similar to these two groups. So the Susan B. Anthony and Dallas Dudley branch was more kind of peaceful. Let's work through everyone together. Alice Paul and Lucy Burns, they were modeled themselves after the British suffragettes who bombed mailboxes and marched in the streets. And in fact, this was kind of a battle that when it came down to Tennessee, fortunately for the state, Alice Paul and Lucy Burns did not step foot in the state of Tennessee during that August 1920 time. There was a group of people that were against women's suffrage, and this is a picture at the Hermitage Hotel. The person in white, with the Confederate flag is one of the supporters of having women not get the right to vote, Josephine Pearson, who's from Mount Eagle. So today we use social media and memes to make fun of people and to kind of ridicule your opponent. And that was done back then, but just with postcards and posters. Here are some anti-women's suffrage things. So this is a picture of a hen wearing a Votes for Women sash and saying to her husband, the rooster, basically, my country calls me. And, it's like, you've got to sit on these eggs. And it says suffragist, feminist, ideal family life. And this is what people were saying about the women that wanted the right to vote. This is another one. So on the left, you have an image of a kind of Victorian woman and her daughter. And look at what it says, the home or street corner for women. So street corner, you're not necessarily implying that someone is marching and speaking on the street. You're talking about something else when you call a woman a street corner woman. So this is something saying voting no. Here's another Victorian woman that's kind of leaving for her suffrage meeting or to vote, and the poor husband with the crying children in the bottle is looking very upset about his wife leaving the family home. Here's another man that's forced to wash the clothes, and here's the kid down below, and he's got a look on his face and it says, everybody works but mother, she's a suffragette. And if you notice here in the picture, he's basically wearing women's clothes. So that's kind of the other thing that they're making fun of or light of. And here's another one, a suffragette's home, and the husband comes home, I guess, expecting his dinner after a hard day's work. And, the woman hasn't washed any clothes, taking care of the children, and he's just mad. And there's Votes for Women in the background.
Hey,
There's another
David,
picture. Yes.
uh, by the way, that's a wonderful one right there. I know how to accumulate these things, but the teachers were asking, how do they show these things to their classes? If you Google suffrage cartoons or whatever, you're going to get some from all over the country, but these are from Nashville, right?
These are nationwide. I would not say that they were from Nashville. I could send you some that the teachers can share with their students.
Okay,
Yes.
that's what we'll do. Thank you.
Okay. So, and this is kind of a very, look at all the women in this picture. Their eyes and their mouths and their noses are all disfigured and just, so this is once again implying these kind of wild-eyed, not very attractive women are the ones that are wanting the right to vote. And then, people are just against women having the right to vote. This is interesting. Now, this is pro-suffrage. It says, not at home, a woman's place is in the home. Were you at your children's school? The vote controls the school. Were you buying dinner? The vote controls pure food laws and market conditions. Were you buying ready-made clothing? The vote controls conditions under which clothing are made. So later, when it came down to Tennessee for the vote, all these manufacturing concerns came to Nashville to fight this and to vote this down. Lobbyists from all over the place. The people that didn't want suffrage were the alcohol companies because they thought women wanted prohibition or they wouldn't repeal prohibition. And so that's why they didn't want it. A lot of manufacturing companies came down here because clothes were made by women and young children in sweatshop conditions, and they didn't want to be regulated. Same thing for the food industry, that, this was the time during Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, that, our food, there was not a lot of regulation of the food industry. So this was a very important part about this. This is Frankie Pierce. She's an African-American woman that belonged to my church, and she was very involved in the women's suffrage industry. The white women, including Ann Dallas Dudley and their local chapter, actually invited Frankie Pierce to testify at the Tennessee State Capitol during this whole amendment. But they had to walk a very tight rope line of, if they were seen as too close to the African-American community, they would lose the votes of the racist people. So remember I said there were two groups of the women's suffrage movement. When World War I broke out, and we just heard this great talk about World War I, the Susan B. Anthony branch of the suffrage movement closed down their offices all across the country. They said, country first, we'll work on our voting later. These women, part of Alice Paul and Lucy Burns' group, they decided not only were they not going to close down, that they were going to start protesting outside the White House during the war. And what was interesting about this is today, people protesting out the White House is no big deal. Someone is always protesting something you've heard of or not. But this was the first time in American history that anyone was protesting out there. And they were calling Woodrow Wilson out. There's a sign here that says, Mr. President, how long must we wait for our liberty? And they burned Woodrow Wilson in effigy outside the White House. What's interesting, you think about security at the White House, even during the war. I love this picture. Here's a picture of Woodrow Wilson just kind of walking with one other person outside of the gate, and these women, passing these women who are not very happy with him right now because he's not advancing the women's suffrage bill. So what happened to these women outside the White House? They were arrested for protesting outside the White House, and they went to jail. This is Lucy Burns in jail. And they saw being in jail as a badge of honor, literally. They went on strike, hunger strikes in jail. And when they got out of jail, they made these pins. These were jail bar pins, and they put stars on them to see how many times they had gone to jail. And then they gave speeches all across the country. They took trains, they had these suffrage trains, and they gave speeches to these women in jail. So after the war was over, the Susan B. Anthony Amendment finally gets out of the House and the Senate. During her life, it made it out of the House once, but not the Senate. And then 1 year it made it out of the Senate, but not the House. And so finally in 1919, it gets out of both houses and goes to states for ratification. The states that you would imagine would quickly ratify it, New York, California, Washington, Pennsylvania, it gets to 10 states. It gets to 20 states. It makes it to 30 states. And then it gets a little bit harder to pick up that magical number of 36. It gets 31, 32, 33, 34, 35, and stalls out the summer of 1920. The Tennessee legislature, per our Constitution, is supposed to meet in January, and the sessions last until they finish their work, which is usually in April, sometimes May. And so by the time the bill made it out of the Congress and it was kind of looking for that last state, the legislature was at home. They were out of session and they would not come back until the next year. There was only one person that can convene the legislature back in session, and it was this man, Governor Albert Roberts. Albert Roberts was a Democrat, and he was in a very tough primary competition with that. So he did not want to touch this suffrage because what he thought, if this passes, he is a political goner. Now in Tennessee, we basically have only had one Republican governor from the Civil War to 1970 and Winfield Dunn. And the first War of the Roses that you will learn about is the War of the Roses in the 1886 governor's race, where you had two brothers running for governor against each other. Bob Taylor, who was the Democrat, and Alf Taylor, who was a Republican. If you were for Bob Taylor, you wore a white rose. And if you were from Alf Taylor, you wore a red rose. And these two brothers who ran against each other went across the state campaigning, but they didn't give campaign speeches. They both played the fiddle. And so you got to hear who was the better fiddler. It was Bob Taylor, the Democrat, and so Bob won. And so that was our first War of the Roses. The second War of the Roses was during the 1920 suffrage time. And this is some sheet music that was put out. So if you were against women's suffrage, you wore a red rose. If you were for women's suffrage, you wore a yellow rose. And so Governor Roberts, here again, doesn't want to touch this even after his primary is over. And these women are just lobbying him, please call the legislature back in session. Only a handful of states the summer of 1920 are left on the map to even ratify it. Connecticut and Vermont both decide not to touch the bill either. And then North Carolina, just before Tennessee, votes no. So literally, it comes down to Tennessee. If it's going to pass, it's going to be Tennessee, the most unlikely state you would think that would ratify the 19th Amendment. So all these people come down here. The Hermitage Hotel is ground zero for both the pro-suffrage side and the anti-suffrage side have offices in the Hermitage Hotel. And so finally, Governor Roberts gets a telegram from Woodrow Wilson, the President of the United States, urging him to call the legislature back into session, which he does in August of 1920. But he knows at the time, if this passes, he is a goner, probably politically, but he does anyway. And it passes the Senate, the upper chamber in the Capitol, by a pretty comfortable margin, about 25-4. And so everyone's feeling a little bit better, but the House chambers is a different story. So the day of the vote, August 18th, 1920, on the floor of the legislature, there's one more red rose against than for. And one of the people that is against is this guy, Harry Burns from Nida, Tennessee, the youngest member of the legislature. He's 24 years old, looks like Leonardo DiCaprio. And he has told the Speaker of the House he is a solid no vote. But that morning, delivered to him is a letter on his desk in the chambers, addressed to the Honorable H.T. Burns, Nashville, Tennessee State Capitol. And fortunately, and look when it's postmarked in Nashville. It's postmarked on the 17th. So it's getting here and it gets delivered immediately to him. And so he reads it. He opens it up and it says, "Dear Harry, I've been watching you. The votes have been contentious on both sides. I don't know how you're going to vote, but I hope you will support suffrage. Signed, your mother." So what is a young child to do? You're told the speaker that you're voting no, but then your mother wants you to vote for it. So when they call the roll, he stands up and changes his no vote to an aye, and 27 million women get the right to vote by a single vote in our state legislature. Remember, this was the room where it happened. This was where just 6 years before the women had their national convention. The most unlikely state, the most unlikely place and way, by one vote, all this happened. Governor Roberts signs the bill and sends the paperwork to Washington. That is Ann Dallas Dudley in the top right-hand corner looking over his shoulder. The kind of grim-faced Governor Roberts, I think, knows he's also signing the end of his political career. So what happens? So this bill passes August 18th, 1920. There's something called National Women's Equality Day, which is celebrated on August 26th, which up until recently, a lot of women here in Tennessee would celebrate as the day suffrage passed. And I pointed out to a lot of my local friends, it's like, why are we celebrating the day that our paperwork made it to Washington? We need to uniquely celebrate August 18th as the day it happened. And so that is what we celebrate today. Harry Burns had to face the voters in November, a few months later, and he only kept his seat by 100 votes. Governor Roberts, not so lucky. Today, he would get a Profiles in Courage Award from the Kennedy family of someone who does something that is good, but politically not good for them. Governor Roberts got beat, and he got beat badly. So remember I said there was basically one Republican between the Civil War and Winfield Dunn in 1970. It was in 1920. And who was that Republican governor that won? He was a 72-year-old man. He was the other brother from the fiddling days back in the 1880s, Governor Albert Roberts, which is why if you take your kids to the Tennessee State Capitol, you'll see busts on the first floor of Governor Bob Taylor and Alf Taylor. And that's the only reason that Alf Taylor got elected, because of the suffrage vote. 2 years later, the governor's term was only 2 years back then. He gets beat by someone by the name of Austin Peay, who is the only governor to die in office in Tennessee history. So I want to show you another picture. This is my great-great-grandmother, Isabel Ewing. Her husband was the first Black lawyer in Nashville, and he served as a judge in the 1880s. It was elected justice of the peace. You had to run on 2-year terms, so he won 3 times. She could never vote for him. She was very involved in the suffrage movement, and she voted in that first election in 1920. How do I know that? This is her voter registration card. This is from October 12th, 1920, Isabel Ewing, colored, Hermitage. There was this myth by some people that talk about women's suffrage that African-American women could not vote. I'm not saying it's easy for African-American women to vote. At first, women did not have to pay a poll tax of any race. And then a case went to the Tennessee Supreme Court, and they said the $2 poll tax, which was a lot of money, also applied to women by the 1926 election. So the New York Times did a story on the 100th anniversary of women's suffrage, and they featured Isabella in that story too. Very proud of that. So this map is quite interesting. So the question is, how many of the other southern states of the Confederacy voted for ratification of the 19th Amendment? If you could see by this map, 0. Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, none of these states voted for ratification, which goes to show you how extraordinary what these women did. That Tennessee, and it barely passes by 1 vote. And so one of my favorite, and the state of Mississippi, there's a wonderful room in the downtown public library. It's called a Votes for Women's room, and it has kind of an interactive map. And if you push Mississippi, they have politicians down there and other interesting facts. But Mississippi did get around to ratifying the 19th Amendment in 1986, a just kind of meaningless ceremonial vote saying, oh, we never got around to doing that. We'll do it now. Another interesting monument is in Centennial Park, done by Alan McQuire, the famous national sculptor. And this features 5 women, including Ann Dallas Dudley, Carrie Chapman Catt, who was head of the organization that took over for Susan B. Anthony to the left, Sue White of Jackson, and then Frankie Pierce, who belonged to my church, the other woman carrying the sign. Why this is kind of interesting, I'll tell you the story of how this statue got built. A group of women, friends of mine, were hosting a very famous woman politician in the 90s named Madeline Kunin. Madeline Kunin was the first woman governor of the state of Vermont. And she came to Tennessee, and she had never been to Tennessee, and she knew her Tennessee history, especially as it relates to suffrage. She gets off the plane, and the first thing she says to these women is, "Take me to the monument you've made to honor the women that got the women the right to vote." And they just kind of looked at each other and said, "We don't have anything." And so they started to raise the money. They raised $1 million for that. And the last slide I want to show you are 2 buildings in downtown Nashville for Amazon. Remember where this presentation started? There was that Nashville Female Academy. And the Nashville Female Academy was located where these 2 Amazon buildings are on Church Street. One of the things that I did on the 100th anniversary of Ann Dallas Dudley marching through the streets of Nashville for the first women's suffrage parades, I wrote an article in the newspaper in the Tennessean about why Capitol Boulevard, which is right in front of the Capitol and the library, needs to be renamed for Ann Dallas Dudley Boulevard, because she literally made history. And a few years later, well before the 100th anniversary, they named it. Amazon has this habit of when they come into the city, they want to kind of immerse themselves into local history and what went on. So they knew the story about the college that was there, and they walk around and they see this Ann Dallas Dudley Boulevard. They don't know who Ann Dallas Dudley is. They contact me and I tell them about Ann Dallas Dudley and about Frankie Pierce, who goes to my church. So what they do in most cities, they name buildings after local people. The building on the right is named Ann after Ann Dallas Dudley. The building on the left is named Juno after Juno Frankie Pierce.
David, when did that happen? When did they name those buildings?
About 4 months ago or 5 months ago. I could send you an article.
No, I believe you. I just didn't know that.
Yep. And the funny thing that probably only you would appreciate on this call, Bill, is Ann Dallas Dudley's son, Guilford Dudley, was dressed up as a young child and marched in these women's suffrage parades. Guilford Dudley built the tallest building in the Southeast in 1957, the LNC Tower, the famous kind of iconic in our skyscraper for many, many years. So Ann has a building that's named after her, and Guilford has his building right down the street on Church Street. So history comes full circle, and I want to open this up for any questions or comments that you all have, and I'd be happy to talk to you some more.
Thanks, David. I'm going to ask a couple of, a few things I've learned. I don't know as much as you do about this stuff, but in 1999, David remembers that I interviewed a lot of people for a book I wrote called Fortunes, Fiddles, and Fried Chicken. And at the time, I didn't know anything about the suffrage movement. And I was interviewing Guilford Dudley, who was about 100 years old at that time. He must have been 95. And he was a picture on his desk of him with his mother in that parade. And I just asked him about it, and he just said, "My mother dressed me up in a parade." And that's all he said, because I was more interested in the LNC Tower, his company, because it was one of the biggest companies in Nashville for many generations. What do you know about Banks Turner, David?
Well, you know the story, I think, a lot about, Harry Burns gets all the credit, but as you know, Banks Turner also kind of changed his vote, and we wouldn't have Harry Burns if it weren't for Banks Turner too.
Tell me what is my theory. There's reporters and there's chaos up there, and Harry Burns is obviously the focus. And you told me once your theory about why he pulled that letter out, that maybe he might not have done that, but why do you think he pulled that letter out?
Yes. So I didn't say this part of the story. So after he votes, I mean, you can imagine the big balcony is full of women and people that don't want this to pass. And then all of a sudden it looks like it's going to fail, and it passes because the youngest member of the legislature changes his vote. So everyone's mad at him. They chase him around the state capitol, House of Representatives chamber. He has to climb out the window, run back to the Hermitage Hotel where he calls his mother and shares the good news. The next day, people are still mad. They're trying to undo this, but they want to bring him up on ethics charges. And Harry's like, they think he was bribed or something really corrupt happened. And Harry's like, oh, no, letter from mom, and that letter is in the East Tennessee Historical Society, which is in Knoxville, and there's a statue of he and his mother that a Knoxville lawyer just recently commissioned on that corner too as well.
And we're constantly making new discoveries. David, I told David this a few days ago. I've been lately researching resort hotels, abandoned resort hotels in Tennessee, and discovered last week that the person who tore down the White Cliff Springs Hotel in McMinn County in the 1930s was Harry Byrne, because he bought the property, he looked at it, but that's like, his name was not mentioned very many times in the newspaper over the next few years. I guess he was a 1 or 2 term state house member, and he didn't get as much attention in his lifetime than you would think. There
was a constitutional convention of the state of Tennessee in the 50s. He served as one delegate of that constitutional convention. He ran for governor unsuccessfully in 1930, but this was the kind of high level mark of his life and career. Oh, and the other thing that Bill will appreciate, and you all too. So when you think about that 1 vote margin of the House of Representatives, and you know how politicians mainly get reelected and the bodies kind of stay the same year after year after year. In 1925, Tennessee passes one of the most controversial bills ever, the Scopes Monkey Law. And the Scopes Monkey Law passes the House of Representatives, which was the same body that gave women the right to vote just 5 years ago. 75 people voted for the Scopes Monkey bill. So you think about that basically the same body that barely gave women the right to vote, years later, they overwhelmingly passed the Scopes Monkey Law.
And when people who were against the suffrage amendment, they made a number of predictions, and they were wrong about many of them. One of them was that Tennessee would immediately turn around and pass the next amendment to the U.S. Constitution, the Child Labor Amendment. The Child Labor Amendment came immediately behind the suffrage amendment, and a lot of people thought if women get the right to vote, that will become law. It actually did not become law, because southern states, including Tennessee, all rejected the Child Labor Amendment. And so children were still working in factories, at least as authorized by the Constitution. It is 6 o'clock, but we still have David. You guys can, if you need to dismiss, but
well, first of all, if you're on Instagram, follow me on Instagram. I'm at the Nashville I Wish I Knew on Instagram. That's the Nashville I Wish I Knew, or my name, David Steele Ewing. Find me there. There's a lot of history. It's a history site mainly. It's not like little party pictures. It's just nerdy history things of Tennessee. So I hope you will find me there.
And by the way, David isn't overstating his importance in like having a street named, and come to think of it, David, there's something I want to talk to you about when we're done. It has to do with something else I want to get through a lawmaking body. Does anyone have any questions? And I'm happy to make someone a speaking person if you like. Just raise your hand.
Do it on video. Yes.
Yeah, do it on video. Well, that didn't work. Okay.
But if you ever have a chance to bring your school children to the state capitol, it's a wonderful place to tell not only this story, but many other stories. It's a beautiful building. It's a public building. And I always hope that when school children go there, they're inspired to want to get involved in politics and government. And maybe we have a future governor or member of the legislature in your group.
Anyone want to raise your hand and talk to David? Oh. Don't have anyone so far.
But no, the
suffrage... one other thing, David, there's one other story I want you to tell. You told me this the first time. Okay, why was the women's building not rebuilt, but the Parthenon was? I don't know the answer to that question, except to say that the Parthenon architecturally meant so much to Greece. And of course, Nashville was called the Athens of the South. There were about 12 buildings that weren't rebuilt.
Most of the buildings weren't rebuilt. Memphis had a building in shape of the pyramid, which was next to the Parthenon. The Parthenon actually was not built to be a permanent building. They tore it down and rebuilt it in the 1920s. and everyone always thinks that they were such geniuses to build a Parthenon, but interestingly enough, in 1897, what was going on a year before that the Parthenon was always in the news? In 1896 in Athens, Greece, we had the first modern Greek Olympics, and we've been having them every 4 years ever since. Interestingly enough, there was a St. Louis World's Fair in 1904, and the state of Tennessee sent them a building that we built, a temporary building on the grounds. We did not build the Parthenon for them. We built a replica of Andrew Jackson's Hermitage.
Okay, here's the other thing that David and I both know about that is pretty funny. A lot of times people use the term perfect 36 to describe the passage of the 19th Amendment. But as it turns out, when tell us how that phrase evolved that time period.
So I'm a curious person by nature, and there was a group of women that celebrated the 90th anniversary, 75th anniversary here in Tennessee, and they kept on talking about the perfect 36. This is great. And in fact, my friends who built this statue in Centennial Park, there's a perfect 36 society. And I was always curious, I was like, where did this come from? So obviously Tennessee was the 36th and final state, but I had not heard of the term perfect 36 before. So there was a silent movie around 1917 that came out called The Perfect 36. And there was a Hollywood starlet that was swimming somewhere and someone had stolen her clothes. And so she's prancing around the rest of the movie kind of half dressed. And this movie is called The Perfect 36. So editorial writers back when this vote was happening, and they knew that this was 36 states would need it, they referred to this movement as the perfect 36, but the term perfect 36 had become a term to objectify women's bodies, referring to their measurements. And so you had advertisers for clothing stores talking about, we have clothes for the perfect 36. And then later, as the flappers became popular in the jazz age of the 20s, there was an article that said the perfect 36 is no longer in vogue, it's the perfect 34. And so all these people today were using this term that was really derogatory. And I looked in Governor Roberts' papers, and there was actually a letter where Ann Dallas Dudley was arguing with somebody else over the gift they would give the legislature for voting for this bill, these people in the House and the Senate. And somebody wanted to give them a knife that said the perfect 36. And Ann Dallas wrote this scathing letter saying, no, we're not going to do this. And she won. And so the gift that was given to all these members of the legislature was a knife that said Tennessee 36 on it. So even Ann Dallas Dudley thought it was offensive at the time.
Some of you may know I do a newspaper column, and I did one about this a year ago. And I found this ad, Mabel Norman is the perfect 36. And that was from 1919, right? The same time period.
Yeah. So the newspaper writers that had these headlines or these references, they were just men, and they were just kind of making light. It's kind of like if you read the headlines of the New York Post, their famous cover stories where they have these kind of puns about something that's going on. Same thing. And so I'm always kind of cringe when someone talks about the perfect 36 because they just don't know the history.
Who's our friend in Memphis who resulted?
Paula Casey.
Huh? Paula.
Casey.
When I told Paula this, she laughed her head off. I told her this. I was the first person to tell her this, and she laughed her head off. So she's got a good sense of humor about it. It is 6:05, and it's time for everyone to have dinner. And teachers, I will be sending you your certificates tomorrow. Next week, we'll be talking about the Battle of New Orleans from Chalmette Battlefield. And I have a presentation, David, on Tennessee's era of the Wild West. And I'll be talking about, among other things, our friend Ned Buntline. You ever heard of Ned Buntline?
No, I haven't.
Okay, then I'm going to ask you to tune into part of this one, because he's a character that was a man who was nearly lynched in Nashville. He was lynched in Nashville, Tennessee, and he almost got murdered. And he later went on to discover Buffalo Bill Cody, and he very much affected the future of the American West. Nearly died in Nashville.
So, that's the kind of great stories that you get for Tennessee history for kids. So well done. Thank you, teachers. I really appreciate it.
And if you want to sign up, just go to Tennessee History for Kids. It's on the top of the front page. All right, we'll talk to y'all later. Thank y'all very much.